This is A News. I'm Bakhtiar Sanova, and let's go through the main headlines. President Donald Trump signals possible Iran deal amid ongoing talks and Strait of Hormuz tensions. Israeli airstrikes hit southern Beirut for the first time since last month's ceasefire. And Russia warns diplomatic missions to evacuate staff ahead of possible strike on Ukraine. Diplomatic efforts between the United States and Iran are continuing as tensions remain high over the conflict and Tehran's nuclear program. The latest remarks from Washington have added fresh attention to the possibility of a breakthrough in the talks.
U.S. President Donald Trump said on Wednesday he expects the war in Iran to end quickly as the United States seeks a deal over Tehran's nuclear program and the Strait of Hormuz. He also said that the U.S. had held very good talks with Iran over the previous 24 hours, adding that a deal between the two sides was very possible.
No, they want to make a deal badly, and we'll see if we get there. If we get there, they can't have nuclear weapons. You know, it's very simple, but what's not to submit? So they had a Navy with 159 ships, and now every ship is blown to pieces and lying at the bottom of the water. They had an Air Force, lots of planes, and they don't have any planes. They don't have any anti-aircraft. They don't have any radar left. Their missiles are mostly decimated. They have some. They have probably 18, 19%, but not a lot by comparison to what they had. And their leaders are all dead. So I think we won.
His comments came as reports emerged from U.S. media that Washington and Tehran could be nearing a one-page deal to end their war. The memo reportedly has 14 points and, according to U.S. news outlet Axios, could serve as the basis for wider nuclear talks. The measures under discussion include suspending Iran's uranium enrichment, lifting sanctions, and restoring free transit through the Strait of Hormuz. Iranian officials say the proposal is still being reviewed. Foreign Ministry spokesman Ismail Baghei said Tehran will study the offer carefully before responding through Pakistani mediators. Senior Iranian lawmakers also warned that Iran is ready to respond if tensions rise further, unless the United States makes major concessions. Despite ongoing talks, President Trump warned military action could resume at a much higher intensity if negotiations fail. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister says Israel remains in full coordination with Washington, adding that he speaks with President Trump almost daily and that both leaders agree all enriched uranium must be removed from Iran.
We share common objectives, and the most important objective is the removal of enriched material from Iran, all of the enriched material, and the dismantling of Iran's enrichment capabilities. President Trump believes he can achieve this one way or another. However, we are prepared for any scenario. And that is the directive I have given to the IDF and our security agencies as well. Israel is stronger than ever. Iran and its proxies are weaker than ever.
In the meantime, oil markets remain highly sensitive to developments between Washington and Tehran, with any rise in tensions around the Strait of Hormuz likely to push energy prices higher and add pressure to the global economy.
Iran's parliamentary speaker and top negotiator Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf said that new attacks by US and Israel cannot be ruled out amid unconfirmed reports that Tehran's response to Washington's peace plan will be announced soon. Here is Turaj Shiralilo.
The Iranian parliamentary speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf has said that Tehran does not rule out renewed military or terrorist attacks, despite unofficial reports of a possible peace process agreement with the U.S. to be announced this week. In an audio message to the Iranians on Wednesday, the top negotiator with the United States said that Iran does not underestimate the possibility of a military attack, especially a terrorist attack. His remarks on the likely military action and terrorist act hinted at the past Israeli-U.S. wars in June 2025 and February 2026, as well as killing of Iranian officials at the time the Iranian and US negotiators were talking indirectly and exchanging draft proposals and counter-proposals. High-ranking Iranian officials, including civilian statesmen and military commanders, stressed that the Islamic Republic does not trust the United States this time again either. President Masoud Pezeshkian told his French counterpart Emmanuel Macron in a phone call on Wednesday evening that any effective negotiation requires an end to the war and guarantees that hostile actions will not be repeated. In another signal that Iran distrusts the US despite of news of a peace arrangement, Mohammad Marandi, a member of the media team accompanying the Iranian negotiators in Islamabad in April, stressed Tehran's readiness for a potential major attack. In a post on X, he rejected certain US media reports suggesting that a peace agreement will be announced soon. He said Iran is fully prepared for a potential major attack before Trump's trip to China. The US President Donald Trump is scheduled to visit China next week, while the Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi visited Beijing on Wednesday. According to the local news media, quoting the MP and former Foreign Minister Manucher Mottaki, Iran responds to Washington's counter-proposal peace plan before the weekend. However, a source in the Iranian Foreign Ministry told A News it was unlikely that Tehran would respond to the US proposal today. Turaj Shiralilu from Tehran for A News.
An Israeli airstrike has hit the southern suburbs of Beirut for the first time since last month's ceasefire, raising fresh concerns over the stability of the truce with Hezbollah. The escalation comes as tensions continue across the region, despite ongoing diplomatic efforts to contain the conflict.
Tensions remain high across the Middle East as Israel continues its operations in Lebanon. Airstrikes hit southern Beirut on Wednesday, marking the first attack on the Lebanese capital since the ceasefire came into effect last month. The escalation comes amid wider diplomatic efforts to ease regional tensions, including ongoing US-Iran negotiations. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says the target was a commander from the Radwan force, an elite unit of the group. In a joint statement with Defense Minister Israel Katz, he said the operation was intended to prevent future attacks on Israeli troops and communities. Israeli media report the commander was killed, though neither the Israeli military nor Hezbollah has confirmed his death. Earlier, Israel issued evacuation warnings for several villages north of the Litani River, raising concerns of a possible expansion of military operations deeper into Lebanese territory. Lebanon's Prime Minister Nawaf Salam says it is still too early for high-level talks, with diplomatic channels between the two sides remaining limited.
U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio met Pope Leo at the Vatican against a backdrop of rising tensions between the White House and the Catholic leader. The meeting comes after Donald Trump stepped up criticism of the Pope over his stance on the Iran war. U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio held talks with Pope Leo at the Vatican in a closed-door meeting. The visit comes as tensions grow between the Vatican and the Trump administration over the Iran war and immigration policy. Donald Trump recently criticized the Pope, accusing him of endangering Catholics and suggesting he supported Iran obtaining nuclear weapons, a claim the Vatican rejects. The Pope has reaffirmed his message of peace, restating the Church's position that nuclear weapons are immoral. As battlefield tensions escalate across Ukraine, Russia has issued evacuation warnings to foreign embassies in Kyiv ahead of Victory Day.
Russia warned foreign embassies and international organizations in Kyiv on Wednesday to evacuate personnel, saying retaliatory strikes could target the Ukrainian capital if Victory Day events in Moscow are disrupted.
A note with the following content was sent to all diplomatic missions accredited with the Foreign Ministry and to representations of international organizations. I quote, On May 4, 2026, the Russian Defense Ministry issued an official statement in connection with threats by the Kiev authorities to strike Moscow on a date sacred to all Russians, Victory Day in the Great Patriotic War. The Russian Foreign Ministry strongly urges the authorities of your country, the leadership of your organization, to treat this statement with the utmost responsibility and to ensure the advance evacuation from the city of Kiev of personnel of diplomatic and other missions, as well as citizens, in view of the inevitability of a retaliatory strike by the armed forces of the Russian Federation against Kiev, including centers of decision-making, should the Kiev regime attempt to carry out their criminal terrorist plans.
The warning comes as fighting continues, despite rival ceasefire proposals linked to Russia's May 9th commemorations. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says Russian forces violated Kyiv's proposed truce more than 1,800 times within hours of it taking effect, with attacks continuing along the front line and in civilian areas. Ukraine's Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiha, meanwhile, accused Moscow of focusing on securing the parade rather than advancing peace efforts. As clashes intensified, a Russian strike hit a kindergarten in Ukraine's northeastern Sumy region, killing 2 people. Officials said no children were inside the building at the time of the attack. The United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission says Russian attacks across 14 Ukrainian regions since last Friday have killed at least 70 civilians and wounded more than 500 others. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says its forces captured 2 settlements in the Donetsk and Sumy regions over the past 24 hours, while also carrying out strikes on Ukrainian military positions, drone facilities, and energy infrastructure across 141 locations. Moscow further claimed its air defense systems intercepted 571 Ukrainian drones, while the Black Sea Fleet destroyed 4 unmanned boats. Ukraine's military, meanwhile, reported 177 clashes along frontline areas and said its forces targeted Russian command centers, assembly points, and air defense systems.
Russia tightens its security before its biggest national celebration on the 9th of May, amid fears of Ukrainian drone strikes. Starting Tuesday, Russia has begun rolling mobile internet shutdowns in Moscow and other cities, which authorities say is to counter drone threats.
Mobile internet will be completely shut down in Moscow on May 9th, Russian Ministry of Digital Development reports. According to the ministry, temporary restrictions will be imposed on mobile internet in Moscow on Victory Day, including access to the whitelist of websites and SMS messages. The ministry stated that home internet and Wi-Fi will operate normally, and that they do not plan to restrict access to mobile internet on May 7th to 8th. However, residents across Moscow already start to feel impact of restrictions on internet. On Tuesday, Russia shut down airports and temporarily cut mobile internet access for many users in Moscow. Local Russian media report that the disruption hit workers hardest, with taxi drivers saying they were unable to receive fares. By midday Tuesday, the Digital Development Ministry said that initial mobile internet restrictions in Moscow had ended and network operators were restoring access. The disruptions come as Moscow prepares for a significantly scaled-back Victory Day parade this weekend. Security in the Russian capital has been visibly tightened in the run-up to the parade, with checkpoints set up across the city and snipers and machine gun crews deployed on Kremlin towers. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the Red Square parade will not feature a display of military hardware. a decision the Kremlin says was made due to an increased risk of Ukrainian drone attacks on the Russian capital. On Monday, Ukraine launched a rare drone assault on Moscow, during which an unmanned aircraft slammed into a high-rise apartment complex not far from the Kremlin.
Russia's foreign ministry says Armenia is being drawn into an anti-Russian orbit by the European Union. Spokeswoman Maria Zakharova accused Yerevan of aligning with aggressive Euro-Atlantic standards, signaling a sharp breakdown in relations between the former close allies.
After reading the text of the final declaration of the so-called Armenia-EU summit, it becomes obvious that the Republic, with its leadership's approval, is ever closer dragged to the alien standards and mechanisms. Those are not European in terms of European culture and civilization, but aggressive Euro-Atlantic ones. Sooner or later, this course pursued by Armenian authorities will inevitably lead to involvement of Yerevan into Brussels' anti-Russian orbit. The formula of the European Union is simple and banal. It is strange that nobody understands this. To squeeze everything out of Armenia, down to the last drop, in order to use it for its own interests, including Russophobic and anti-Russian ones, without giving anything in return except PR stunts.
Maersk has beaten first quarter profit expectations, but is warning that the Iran war is clouding the outlook for global shipping. The company says disruption in the Middle East is driving up fuel costs and adding uncertainty to freight rates. Maersk has beaten first quarter profit forecasts, but kept its full-year outlook unchanged, warning that the Iran war is adding uncertainty to global shipping. The company posted EBITDA of $1.73 billion for the first quarter, above expectations, but sharply lower than a year earlier. It maintained container volume growth guidance of 2 to 4%, but flagged risks from higher energy prices and disruption in the Upper Gulf, which handles around 6% of global container trade. Now we'll take a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss US-Iran negotiations and Israel-Hezbollah tensions in Lebanon. Stay tuned. Welcome back to A News. We're now following developing geopolitical shifts across the Middle East, where reports suggest advanced US-Iran negotiations on a framework deal that could ease tensions and potentially reshape regional security dynamics, including maritime access through the Strait of Hormuz. At the same time, violence has continued to flare between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, with renewed strikes reported in Beirut and southern Lebanon, despite earlier ceasefire understandings. Against this backdrop, questions are emerging over whether a potential de-escalation between Washington and Tehran could alter Israel's security calculations and its ongoing military posture in Lebanon. Joining us now from Tel Aviv to discuss the implications is geopolitical analyst and security expert Eitan Sharnov. Mr. Sharnov, welcome and thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
Mr. Sharnov, if a US-Iran framework deal is finalized, how could it reshape Israel's security doctrine in the region? And does reduced US-Iran tension necessarily translate into reduced Israel-Hezbollah hostilities in Lebanon?
These are all great questions, and the reality is the short answer is it's too soon to tell. I think that there's a few key variables that we need to follow. Number one is, will there even be a deal? Just because President Trump has so far been reluctant to resume hostilities, despite various actions by Iran, and seems to be making several concessions, the reality is he's a tough negotiator, and his tough negotiating is what led to epic fury in the first place. And I do believe that it's highly reasonable that an unfavorable outcome from negotiations could trigger eventual new U.S. action against Iran. But assuming there is a deal, I think that it will likely be one that takes at least some of Israel's key demands into account, especially around the nuclear issue. And it will probably, in the short term, limit Israel's capacity to strike Iran unilaterally and perhaps contain Israeli action in Lebanon. However, I believe in the medium and long term, Israel will regain its freedom of unilateral action, and there will always be some unexpected event, especially if we're talking about Lebanon, some Hezbollah attack, some unique opportunity to kill a senior leader, something like that, that will eventually re-trigger some sort of future violence, certainly in Lebanon. And I believe that if Iran crosses certain red lines, by the way, even today, while Trump is holding fire, digging out nuclear stockpiles, arming missiles, something like that, Israeli unilateral action is never really fully off the table.
In your view, could Israel feel strategically isolated if Washington and Tehran move toward de-escalation?
Well, I think that Israel is inherently no longer isolated vis-a-vis Iran, because today the GCC has also, after Epic Fury, felt the wrath of Iranian outlash in the form of thousands of ballistic missile and thousands of drone attacks. And so I think that the fates of Israel and the GCC vis-a-vis Iran are far more transparently linked than they ever have been. So Israel and its immediate security interests might be partially compromised if there's some sort of deal. I happen to think Trump isn't going to make a deal that's bad for Israel. It may not be amazing for them, but I think he's made his intentions and his allegiances and his allyships very, very clear, and he values the relationship with Israel and sees Israel as a worthy client state, I think, if I were to translate it into transactional terms. But ultimately, Israel is not isolated with Iran because it shares its fate now with the GCC.
Mr. Chanov, what risks does continued escalation in Lebanon pose for a wider regional conflict despite U.S.-Iran talks?
Well, I think ultimately it doesn't really translate into wider regional conflict. I think that Iran is very much trying to frame it as a trigger for regional conflict because it wants to preserve whatever's left of Hezbollah. And that branding is by and large working. However, if you sort of remove the media headlines and the statements, actions in Lebanon tend to stay in Lebanon, certainly since the fall of Assad and with the Syrian regime, the new Syrian regime's own hostilities towards the terror group. The Lebanese issue is devastating for Lebanon, devastating for Israel's north, but it isn't something that can trigger regional conflict. That is, in my opinion, Iranian propaganda.
So what is the significance of the Strait of Hormuz discussions for broader regional stability, including Israel's security outlook?
So Iran brilliantly used the Strait of Hormuz as a means to reframe what's important and what needs to be from a regional military perspective. Iran was very badly damaged in a very one-sided conflict. Their capacity to inflict strategic harm, honestly, on anybody was surprisingly limited. Their capacity to fire lots of missiles in lots of places was definitely surprising to some. But they didn't really cause catastrophic strategic harm. And so they shifted the focus to Hormuz because now this is an additional negotiating piece that brings the entire world into play here and has immediate global economic issues. So the Strait of Hormuz, for good or for bad, certainly for the Iranian perspective, for good, is now a tremendous piece of negotiations and one Iran hopes to use to get more concessions elsewhere in return for reopening the strait. The reality is, I don't think prices of oil and other goods that make their way through that part of the world are going to go down so quickly because the reality is Iran can reclose the straits whenever they choose. The truth is Iran doesn't even have the military capability to truly close the straits. It's the global insurance companies that don't want to take risks, that are ultimately the ones that have really caused this freeze due to Iranian pressure and scare tactics.
Mr. Chanov, from a military perspective, how prepared are the regional actors for a wider escalation if diplomacy fails?
Well, I think the GCC surprised a lot of analysts with how strong their air defenses were. Now, it varies from country to country, But certainly when we look at the UAE, their interception rates were a little over 90%, according to the Ministry of Defense from the UAE, that was putting out daily, sometimes hourly updates. That's on par with Israel. So certainly the United Arab Emirates demonstrated a world-class air defense system. The Saudis performed quite well as well, and the other countries on a sliding scale of decently to quite poorly. I think that ultimately, though, the genie is out of the bottle. The Iranian threat is clear. And I think that by and large, GCC governments want to see the threat neutralized one way or another.
So could internal politics in the United States and Iran limit the ability of negotiators to actually implement any agreement?
Well, we have two separate issues in each country.
Yes.
When we talk about political issues within Iran, the leadership is splintered. It was designed to splinter. The Iranians, over 15 years ago, adopted a structure of military command called the Mosaic Doctrine, which is very unusual in the Middle East, actually, where local commanders have true independence and were actually given orders in advance if there's ever a decapitation strike, as there ended up being, that they can sort of operate independently, shoot at targets that they want opportunistically. And that's what we saw happen. Israel and the United States took out the political leadership of Iran, and the IRCG has wrestled a lot more control than it used to have, not just from the political branch, by the way, but also from the theological branch. However, that being said, it doesn't mean that they have true hegemony yet. I think that there's real disagreements between the politicians and not even the entire military, specifically the IRCG. And while most commentators are predicting the IRCG will win out, I think only time will tell. On the United States side, I think the issue is a little bit more simple. Yes, the Democrats, by default, will be against anything Trump does, by and large. There's a very isolationist movement within the Republican Party, which has representation within Trump's administration, that definitely don't want to see continued conflict. And I think that's actually part of what Trump is doing right now. He doesn't want to have a war powers vote. He has had Rubio and Hegseth both declare an end to epic fury. They're now entered into a prolonged and very intentional negotiation window. But I think that buying time right now to negotiate will also give him the political cover he needs domestically to launch a new military operation under a new name with new goals, under a new timeline, in order to restart the 60-day clock a president has before they really need to go get approval from the legislature to prosecute a war.
Eitan Chanov, thank you very much for your insights and for joining us on the program. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thank you. After the break, we'll take a look at the key stories shaping the region. Welcome back to A News, and now we turn to our regional stories. The multinational joint exercise FS 2026 underway in Turkey continues successfully with the active participation of servicemen from the Azerbaijani army. According to Azerbaijan's Ministry of Defense, the drills are being conducted in conditions adapted to real combat scenarios, where Azerbaijani servicemen have demonstrated combat readiness and tactical expertise while carrying out assigned missions. As part of the second phase of the exercise, Azerbaijani troops joined military personnel from Turkey, Albania, Nigeria and Romania in complex field operations focused on cave, shelter and tunnel search missions, as well as mountaineering training. A delegation of the armed forces of the Republic of Uzbekistan has visited Azerbaijan as part of the military cooperation between the two countries. During the Baku visit, the Uzbek delegation toured several key institutions of the National Defense University, including the Military Management Institute, the Foreign Language Center, the War Games Center, and the Heydar Aliyev Military Institute. Officials also presented an overview of Azerbaijan's modern military education system and discussed ongoing reforms and development in defense training. Two countries and 3 years of near total silence between them. Georgia and Ukraine fell into a bitter diplomatic rift after Russia's 2022 invasion. Now, signs of renewed dialogue are emerging, but the road back is complicated. Nini Nikolaishvili has more.
On May 4th, on the sidelines of the European Political Community Summit, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky sat down with Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze one-on-one for the first time in years. 2 days later, their foreign ministers held a phone call agreeing to meet in person and work toward what both are carefully calling normalization. So what broke them apart? When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Georgia's ruling party, Georgian Dream, refused to join international sanctions against Moscow, and trade between the two countries actually grew. Kiev recalled its ambassador. Zelensky called Georgia's position immoral. In response, Georgian Dream did not back down. It built a political fortress around the decision. Party elites constructed a narrative that American, European, and Ukrainian officials were conspiring to force Georgia to open a second front against Russia, and anyone pushing back was labeled an enemy of Georgian sovereignty. This narrative was weaponized ahead of the 2024 parliamentary elections, presenting Georgians with a stark choice: Georgian Dream in power or war. This switch, though, is being driven entirely by Kiev. On May 6th, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Andriy Sybiga called his Georgian counterpart Maka Bachorishvili, a direct dialogue after their first face-to-face in Yerevan just 2 days prior. Both agreed to meet again in person, but Bachorishvili acknowledged the initiative was coming from Ukraine's side and attached a condition to it. The grievances that accumulated over these years must be understood by Kiev on Georgia's terms, not dismissed, before relations can genuinely move forward. Zelensky is clearly running a wider play here. This same week, he met with Slovak Prime Minister Robert Fico, another leader who kept notable distance from Kiev during the war, agreeing on joint government meetings by the end of June. The pattern is deliberate. Facing a long and unresolved conflict, Zelensky is choosing negotiation and outreach over confrontation, pragmatically rebuilding every relationship he can. Nini Nikolaishvili, Tbilisi, A News.
A new shipment from Russia to Armenia has been transferred via transit through Azerbaijan, marking the first transportation of aluminum products along this route. 2 wagons carrying aluminum products with a combined weight of 133 tons are currently being transported in transit through Azerbaijani territory. In addition, 10 rail wagons loaded with grain cargo weighing a total of 700 tons were dispatched. The wagons departed from Bilajari station and are heading toward Büyükkesik. So far, more than 26,000 tons of grain have been sent from Russia to Armenia, via transit through Azerbaijan. And that global push is now visible on the exhibition floor in Istanbul, where Saha 2026 is bringing together defense firms and official delegations from more than 140 countries. A News' Nuray Mustafa is there for us.
The International Defense Exhibition Saha 2026 continues on its next day, bringing together both local participants and national pavilions from various countries. The broad international representation further highlights the event's global significance and its role as a platform for international cooperation. Companies representing different countries are showcasing defense industry products, military technologies, security systems, and innovative solutions throughout the exhibition area. According to official information, more than 140 countries are represented within the framework of Saha 2026. Current information indicates that national pavilions and companies from Azerbaijan, the United Arab Emirates, the United States, Germany, France, China, Japan, Hungary and Slovakia are taking part in the exhibition.
So Canada right now is the only non-European country that's involved in SAFE. And the other exciting part about that is typically non-EU defense procurement only allows non-EU countries to participate at a 35% level. Canada has access to 80%. So again, it's just another mechanism where Canada is looking to cooperate. We have good capacity and capability, and we'll do that ourselves where we can, but again, time is of the essence for us. We need to move quickly.
There's always a collaboration agreement, partnership agreement, and MOUs. But we actually announce them once it is signed. So probably later in this show, maybe tomorrow, after tomorrow, there will be some MOU signed and we'll publish it at a time. But these are also an opportunity to meet our partner, because every industry requires, suppliers and integrator and, support partnership with them.
The pavilions feature unmanned aerial vehicles, modern weapon systems, cybersecurity technologies, and other advanced defense industry products. Meetings and presentations involving foreign participants are creating broad opportunities for establishing new partnerships, exchanging expertise, and discussing joint projects. Experts believe that the active participation of international companies and official delegations will make a significant contribution to expanding cooperation in the defense industry across the region. At the same time, the exhibition is regarded as an important platform for local companies seeking access to new markets and opportunities to establish links with international investors. Nuray Mustafa, Avaz Hacıyev for A News, Istanbul, Turkey.
Azerbaijan's space agency Azercosmos and Turkish tech firm Profen have signed a satellite capacity agreement at the Saha Expo 2026 in Istanbul. Under the deal, Profen will leverage the Azerspace 1 and Azerspace 2 satellites to provide communication services across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East.
This memorandum is about Azercosmos satellite capacity coverage in Europe, Middle East, and Central Asia, and Profen's satellite communications requirements. These regions for maritime, aero, in-flight connectivity business, as well as SATCOM on the pause and other fixed satellite communications business. So it's very critical for us as Profen to use this space segment, Azercosmos powerful space segment, in those regions for these SATCOM capabilities for our customers.
With this agreement which we did today with Profen in this event, we are aiming to expand our satellite-based and ground segment services in Europe, Turkey, Middle East and African regions. As you know, nowadays defense industry becoming more and more powerful and meaningful for every country. That's why signing of this agreement in this event especially important for us. We hope with this and continuous agreements in this sector, we will expand our technology capabilities worldwide and especially in this region.
Turkey's defense industry is seeing fresh export momentum, with Ankara announcing more than $2.8 billion in defense and aviation exports in the first 4 months of 2026. Here are the details.
The defense sector is again in the spotlight here in Turkey, where Trade Minister Omar Bolat announced Wednesday that Turkish defense and aviation exports topped $2.8 billion in the first 4 months of 2026. The figure marks a 28% increase on the same period last year, highlighting Ankara's growing ambition to turn its defense industry into a major export engine. And the Saha 2026 defense exhibition, now underway in Istanbul, is providing the stage for that push. At the exhibition on Wednesday, Turkey and Kenya signed a major defense cooperation agreement. Aimed at enhancing bilateral defense ties, the deal was signed by Turkish Defense Minister Yaşar Güler and his Kenyan counterpart, Rosalinda Soypantuya. The same day also saw a major development for Turkish drone manufacturer Baykar. The company signed its first export agreement for its Bayraktar Kızılelma unmanned aerial vehicle with Indonesia's PT Republic Aero Digantara. The deal covers a 12-drone squadron scheduled for delivery in 2028, with options for additional aircraft and local production facilities in Indonesia. Taken together, the announcements show how Turkey is combining defense diplomacy, export growth, and advanced drone technology to expand its global footprint. In recent years, Turkey has emerged as one of the world's leading producers of aerial drones, accounting for an estimated 65% of the global armed drone export market. Baykar alone controls roughly 60% of this market, having signed export agreements with 37 countries, both for its tactical TB2 Bayraktar platform and its high-altitude Akinji-class drones. This is Adamaro for A News in Istanbul, Turkey.
Now we'll take a short break. Right after the break, we'll discuss Georgia-Ukraine relations and the unresolved diplomatic issues between Tbilisi and Kiev. See you shortly. Welcome back to A News. We now shift our focus to a regional story for discussion. We're following diplomatic signals between Tbilisi and Kiev as Georgia and Ukraine acknowledge unresolved issues despite renewed high-level contacts. Georgian Prime Minister Irakli Kobakhidze says key issues between the two countries remain open, including the status of diplomatic representation, even as both sides speak of restoring dialogue. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has meanwhile pointed to renewed engagement with Georgia and Slovakia, framing it as a part of a broader effort to unblock relations with partner states amid ongoing regional realignments linked to the war in Ukraine and EU integration processes. To discuss what this renewed but fragile diplomatic engagement means for Georgia-Ukraine relations and the wider South Caucasus Euro dynamic, we are joined by Mariam Kinsurashvili, Strategic Communications Security Sector Reform Expert, who speaks to us from Valencia, Spain. Ms. Kinsurashvili, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Bakhtiar. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So how would you assess the current state of Georgia-Ukraine relations after these recent statements from both sides?
So I would describe this as the cautious reopening rather than a genuine normalization at this point of the diplomatical ties and diplomatical relations. So seeing the images, of course, from the Yerevan summit caused a wide resonance in the Georgian public, as even the most devoted supporters of Ivanishvili regime, they still wish well to Ukrainian people and they largely support Ukraine's fight against Russia. Seeing the images of Zelensky and Kobakhidze in Yerevan was quite symbolic because it showed two different realities. It showed the leader, the wartime leader who stands at the front of fighting from the principles of a free world. And on the other side, seeing Kobakhidze as executor of the political will of the oligarch, the political line of the oligarch, which this line has seriously shifted Georgia from its European path and greatly damaged Georgian people and at the same time Georgia-Ukraine relations. So a meeting, a photograph, a diplomatic exchange, a call between foreign ministers, it's of course a good step was restarting the diplomatic relations, but they cannot, I would say, erase the damaged political record. First of all, Georgian dreams ambiguity towards Russia and in the end of the day, positioning the way that Russia benefits in the region. And also, Ukraine might be reopening this channel with Georgia as the part of their wise, pragmatic wartime diplomacy, but it doesn't mean that it's rehabilitating Georgian dreams face for now. So,
Ms. Kinsurashvili, do you see Zelensky's restoration of dialogue as symbolic or substantive at this stage?
At this stage, of course, it's symbolic because there are a lot of unresolved issues still pending between the two countries. And symbolism does matter in diplomacy, as we all know, because Georgia and Ukraine have historically shared a similar path to post-Soviet republics who are fighting for their European and pro-democratic future and trying to rid themselves from Russian imperialism. But at this point, if we don't see further actions and further steps, especially from the Georgian side, it will stay symbolic.
So you have also mentioned the war in Ukraine. How has the war in Ukraine reshaped Georgia's foreign policy positioning toward both Kiev and Moscow?
I think that rather than reshaping, it opened up the contradictions in Georgian Dream's foreign policy. Because from one side, Georgian state, they publicly state that they support Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, but on the other side, the whole domestic and foreign course of Georgian Dream shows a completely different picture. So we see that Georgian Dream, by not joining the national sanctions against Russia, but by even not cooperating and keeping sanctions integrity, by blocking Georgian volunteers to fight in Ukraine, and not only blocking, but in many cases gaslighting and even persecuting them, and the most importantly, using Ukraine in their internal propaganda rhetoric, has of course damaged the relations and opened up the issues that pro-European politics and civil society has been indicating for a long time, even before the full-scale invasion, I'm sorry. So yes, it has reshaped their course publicly, but the problems existed long before the full-scale invasion.
So in your view, could improved Ukraine-Slovakia engagement indirectly influence Georgia-Ukraine normalization?
Indirectly is the key word here, because we see that President Zelensky is signaling that he's ready for normalizing relations with so-called difficult governments for Ukraine, and Slovakia is one of them, as well as Georgia. However, there are key differences because Slovakia is a member of EU and NATO. It's vitally important for Ukraine to normalize relations with Slovakian leadership. Georgia as well is important because of other reasons, for example, for the Black Sea security and the whole regional architecture, which is quite important for Ukraine, which is also a Black Sea state. So another interesting point here is that by weaponizing this normalization narrative inside Georgia, Ivanishvili and his supporters are trying to launder their reputation, because now it's become more and more dangerous and not always beneficial to be in the pro-Putin camp of Putin's friends. So I'm sure the Georgian Dream will use it in their rhetoric. From Zelensky's side, we see a lack of emotions, which is very important when you are the wartime leader, and choice towards the pragmatic diplomacy. From the Georgian side, we still see only rhetoric and internal propaganda.
Ms. Kinsurashvili, to what extent are domestic political dynamics in Georgia influencing its stance toward Ukraine?
I think they are very central because the war in Ukraine has been constantly used by the Georgian Dream to discipline the opposition into fear, and in general the voters, the public, into fear, because we remember how in 2024 they built their whole election campaign on the suffering of Ukrainian people and depicting Ukraine's tragedy, and then positioning themselves as the party of peace, and then demonizing Zelensky and our Western partners as the party of war. Also, like Georgia's backsliding and downsliding into the authoritarianism, it harms a lot, not only Georgian society internally, but Georgia's credibility as a trusted partner in the region, in the broader region. So yes, internal backsliding is very important in this context, in the context of Georgia-Ukraine bilateral relationships, but also in the context of the further Georgian-West relationships, I would say.
So what would be the key indicators to watch in the coming month to judge whether this dialogue is truly progressing?
There are several points. I would point out that, first of all, we need to see this diplomatic contact to be institutionalized and become more institutionalized and more constant, with not only the photographs and internal PR, but also concrete steps towards normalization. Secondly, I would expect Georgian Dream to change their rhetoric of demonization of Ukrainian people and Ukrainian leadership. Also, Georgia would start cooperating on the sanctions integrity, which is very important issue. Another thing would be the Georgia's return to its European past, which is written in our constitution and overwhelmingly supported by Georgian public. And I think one of the points here would be Ivanishvili and his close circle himself, because once they position Georgia at the center and as a top priority, not their financial interest, then we have hope here.
Mariam Kinsurashvili, thank you very much for joining us and sharing your insights on this evolving diplomatic relationship. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Bakhtiar.
Thank you. That's the news for this hour. Stay tuned to A News for all the latest updates.